of how an hourglass can run, even though it's in a free fall, it still remains stable. And this is why temperature is so valuable, because even in a computer or the hourglass, it's all both indicative of a time lapse of heat dispersion. The grains are being held up because there's friction, and in friction, well, you're going to have yourself a certain amount of heat. And so as they're dropping, it's releasing and compressing heat like a piston would, but on a really small scale. The computer, on the other hand, is entirely off heat, and it's only at the unplugging of the cord where you'll be able to see that directly. And just like in life, if you're trying to get like hot on the trail or the trail's gone cold, same aspect, but it's more of just the cognition of your brain cooling or heating if you're hot-headed and lose your temper quickly. And temper is a direct word related to temperature. And so when you're saying, my blood is boiling, I've lost my temper, that's literally directed from like a trail gone cold, or if you're hot on the trail. Oh, the third option, the computer could run out of batteries, it could get hit by a lightning bolt, or it could induce a virus from the internet if it's connected to. If it's connected to the computer, you can have a screensaver running, and then a virus could just pop up on the computer and it would black out. One thing I saw was kind of cool. Like a screen was blacking out, but before it did, it had left up like the image of the display, but in a more faint view. So if you ever have like a contrast of a screen and you can turn it on darker and dimmer, it'll fade out and it kind of looks like a ghost's illumination of a body. Like it's all there, it's just more faint. And that's usually the image that's displayed when you unplug like a charge cord. The light on it will remain on. If it's like a green light when it's charging, you unplug it, that green light will remain on for a set amount of time. So retrospectively, the entire time the hourglass is falling is very much the same. That the entire time that the hourglass is falling is very much just the same as the screensaver if it was being turned off. If you stretched that amount of time from when it's being turned off to it being completely blank, it would be fading out pixel by pixel, and that's the direct correlation. It's just differentiated in two time windows drastically, depending on how quickly the screen is discharged from its light. But that would be the wild card aside from the algorithm. Direct correlation in either case. And why would I be relating Bluetooth and Wi-Fi to a physical wing nut and washer when it is easy to misunderstand? So I'm gonna make it as direct as possible. When you have a screensaver and an hourglass, you can put them right next to each other and stare at them all day. You would have to refresh the hourglass by turning it upside down. The screensaver would continue until the battery of the computer runs out, or you get a short circuit from a giant crash from an electric bolt. Nonetheless, if you set them right by each other, they're actually both on a time scale, and then it's not directly, where it's indirect in an algorithm. One thing that sensibility would induce, if you don't know a computer screen, if you've never seen it before, and then you're sort of familiar with an hourglass, you'd look at the two, and then you take a really close look at the computer screen, and you might see that it's made up of pixels. And so then you look closer at the hourglass, you see it's made up of sand grains. And what is moving in the screensaver is the pixels changing. What's moving in the hourglass is the sand grains dropping. And you might, come up with an investigation tactic where the points that are moving are equal in both systems. But what would be the curveball is the screensaver. It could be anything. There's nothing justifiable. Whereas in the hourglass, the sand grains dropping are accumulated with its the time waning of the shape of the grain with the drop of the sinkhole. The screensaver, whatever its display is, has nothing to do with actual physicality in either. Whereas you could just stare at that all day and try and understand the pixels of the animation. It's not going to work out. It's the behind the curtain. If you don't trust your doctor, it's usually the politician that is hiding behind the white coat. The politician behind the white coat, but inside of the lab is gonna be the hardware to the screen's pixels. Those are two needing account for to have the screensaver run its time course. And its time course is the algorithm. The algorithm can be found in the grains of sand, but each time you flip it upside down, the algorithm would change of the drop rate per grain to the sinkhole. So as elusive as a screensaver may be in hiding the clear-cut fact, well, the hourglass is just as elusive each time it's changed setting from the bottom glass to the top, each time you switch it or touch it or move it from its, if you start shaking it as the sand is dropping, well, you've just changed the algorithm completely. So the great set point of an hourglass is that its flat top and its flat bottom are able to hold the algorithm of the grains because they're set up in a mound of a pile, and that pile mound, as unstable it is with the sinkhole in the middle, is just like a spring because it's sprung into action anytime the grain is able to fall through the sinkhole, meaning anytime that there is a above cartridge holding sand that it can fall through. Whereas the computer, its top and bottom placements are strictly in the algorithm, aside from the hard wiring of its hard drive. And when things are up in the air, it's not even that bad. It's just you've got to know what's going on. So if it's across the board, you're going to be able to find it up in the air. If it's up in the air, you got to know the airwaves. And when that comes into an interpool, well, now you have an interplay. And it's just not being ran by airheads. Because if it is, then they'll leave it up in the air. And so when you've got the sky at your dismay, and even above that, you can actually articulate the same amount of angles that a washer and wing nuts would induce when being tightened on screws or fastened on boards. I guess just the worst case scenario would to be subject without knowing, and then kind of that happens with the carbon footprint, is that you wouldn't understand how the cycle of air is through trees, and then those are cut down, the carbon emission, and represented to a common person would just be inadequate when it comes to emission processes for a certain standard. The threshold if it's not even articulated to pound per square inch, you're pretty much looking at a rough shot across the board. So the main threat is not the motherland, but if you have a whole bunch of bad apples or training to infiltrate fractures to induce more upset and less continuity, a controlled chaos, well then you're gonna have less hot spots and more unavailability. Maybe not at first glance, but if you were to show someone the first glance of what Wi-Fi and Bluetooth were, they probably wouldn't be able to connect. And when you're talking about hot off the press, well, this is, in layman's term, news of what everyone wants to see, to know what's happening. But I'm not even mad against dotting. Some of the dots have made up the greatest artworks I've been ever seen. And if you're into pixelation, you can't have a gradation of a spectrum without it. That's why seeds are so great, because they're abundant. But how many things can retention time account for if it's being used non-locally? Non-locally, as in not everyone is able to know the coordination, yet abiding is mandatory. I always have my hands full because there's always a lot on my plate. I've noticed something really interesting is that retention time can allow a catapult to have a maximum speed. It can also allow a ponytail to hide grease on the scalp without it showing.